Thank you for joining us for tonight's webinar on clinical trials. Clinical trials are the primary means by which new cancer treatments are developed, tested, and approved. In this webinar, you will learn why a clinical trial may be right for you, understand the different phases of and common terms used in clinical trials, and hear tips on talking to your doctor about your clinical trial options.
The access code you entered is invalid.
I am Mary Margaret Kilmeyer, and I am the Patient Resource Coordinator for Debbie's Dream Foundation Curing Stomach Cancer. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist and currently completing my doctorate in marriage and family therapy. My clinical and research background is focused on working collaboratively with doctors, patients, their families, and members of a healthcare team. We would like to thank Genentech for providing funding to make this webinar possible. We would also like to thank our promotional partner, Patient Resource. You will be able to ask questions during tonight's webinar. You can type your question into the white text box that appears on your screen. At the conclusion of the presentation, we will address questions as time allows. If we don't have time for your question, we will try to address it during our next webinar taking place on January 7th at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time. In addition to the recording of this webinar, the recording of this webinar will be able to be viewed on our website in approximately 1 week. Tonight, I will introduce Debbie Zellman, who will share with you her journey and information about Debbie's Dream Foundation. Then Dr. Jordan Berlin will present on clinical trials. And then there will be a short time allowed at the end of the presentation for questions and answers. I would now like to introduce the President and Founder of Debbie's Dream Foundation, Debbie Zellman.
Thank you, Mary Margaret. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us. And to those who stayed on from our webinar just right before this about nutrition. So a little bit about my story. I was diagnosed in April of 2008 with stage 4 stomach cancer. I was 40 years old, the mother of 3 young children, married to a physician and a practicing attorney with my own firm. I had no risk factors for stomach cancer, and my symptoms were very vague. My chances, I was told, of being alive in 5 years was only 4%. At the time of my diagnosis, there were no resources, there was no one to talk to, no one to ask questions to, very little research going on, and only one standard chemotherapy regimen. A year later, I felt lucky to be alive. I realized that I was one of the few who responded to the chemotherapy that was available. So I decided to make a difference for others, and in April of 2009, I founded Debbie's Dream Foundation Curing Stomach Cancer. A lot of people don't realize I am still a patient. I still receive Herceptin by IV every 3 weeks and an oral chemo called Tykerb every night. As part of my activities as a patient advocate, I serve on the NCI Esophagogastric Task Force. I also serve as a patient advocate on the NCCN Gastric and Esophageal Guidelines Committee. In addition, Debbie's Dream Foundation is a member of the Deadliest Cancer Coalition, PEAK, the Patient Equal Access Coalition, SPEAK, which is the State Patient Equal Access Coalition, and OVAC, which is One Voice Against Cancer. And a lot of people like to tell me my most notable achievement is that I appeared on Dr. Oz in an episode about stomach cancer. Next slide. Some of the facts about stomach cancer. People don't realize that stomach cancer is one of the leading causes of cancer death worldwide. It is second in men and fourth in women. Each year, nearly 930,000 people worldwide are diagnosed with stomach cancer, and approximately 700,000 of them will die. More than 22,000 Americans are diagnosed with stomach cancer each year, and more than 11,000 will die that year. It is considered a small population cancer in the United States. It's also on the rise in young people ages 25 to 39. Per cancer death, however, stomach cancer receives the least amount of federal research funding of any cancer. As you heard me say earlier, there are few resources and support services for stomach cancer patients, and most people know very little about this disease. Next slide. As a result of all that information, I founded De-Stream Foundation to raise awareness about stomach cancer, advance funding for research, and provide education and support internationally to patients, families, and caregivers with our ultimate goal of curing stomach cancer. Our website is debystream.org. Next slide. I'm happy to tell you that we have hit a lot of milestones in our 5.5 years of existence. We've had events all across the United States. We have 24 chapters, 21 of which are in the United States, 2 are in Canada, and 1 is in Germany. We have stomach cancer education symposia each year and free webinars to educate stomach cancer patients, families, and caregivers. We also have a free patient resource education program that we abbreviate PREP, which helps hundreds of patients, families, and caregivers throughout the world. We match inquirers with a mentor, and that mentor is a stomach cancer survivor or caregiver. They are matched with the inquirers using specific disease criteria, including stage, biomarker, age, gender, and region. We match them as closely as possible. In addition, we offer a lot of resources and education on our website. We have an in-depth stomach cancer information section called Stomach Cancer 101. Every lecture that we have, like this webinar, is housed on our lecture library on our website year-round. We have clinical trial information and a clinical trials matching service. We also have a blog with many topics there. We have a one-of-a-kind stomach cancer support community as well. Many, many resources and related links on our website. And our website is translatable into more than 60 languages by simply going to the home page, scrolling to the bottom, and choosing the language you desire. We've also funded $150,000 in research grants. We've also changed the landscape of federal funding for stomach cancer research through 2 Capitol Hill Advocacy Days and our Capitol Hill briefing that we held this past February. In fact, we've just gotten word that we have changed the landscape by $50 million because we were successful in getting stomach cancer included in a research funding pot. Next slide. You can see this is the homepage of our website. We make it very easy to navigate and to find those resources for the patients, families, and caregivers. And you can see some of the buttons there. The resource inquiry form directly links to the inquiry form that the patient, family, or caregiver fills out, and they receive their mentor, as well as buttons for finding clinical trial, the stomach cancer blog, and the support community. And there's many more resources as well under the information and support tab at the top of the website. Next slide. If you were on the earlier webinar, you heard about some of our events, which we're thrilled to have everyone get involved with and support. And you can read more about those events on our website. At this time, I'm going to turn it back over to our moderator, Mary Margaret. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Debbie. And so here we have some contact information for our local headquarters. We are located in Davie, South Florida, and our office hours are Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. And here you have some contact information, phone numbers, and important email addresses that you might like to note. And so now I'd like to move to our clinical trials webinar. Our presenter this evening is Dr. Jordan Berlin. Dr. Berlin is a medical oncologist who specializes in GI malignancies and new drug development. As the clinical director of the GI oncology program at VICC, he directs the development and conduct of clinical trials for GI cancers at Vanderbilt. And at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Berlin.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Okay,
excellent. So I guess, because this will be the first time I've seen the slides in several months, go to the next slide. Oh, there's my dog. So I'm talking about demystifying clinical trials, because clinical trials, as you all know, doctors tend to speak in our own language, and clinical trials seem complex, but they're actually not as complex as we all think. In the meantime, I'm going to show you gratuitous pictures of my dogs who are sitting next to me, because that way they might not bark during the course of this event. although there's no guarantee. Next slide. So, like I said, doctors tend to use a lot of terms for the same things. I use I use this slide mostly as a joke to show what we really do. Is that a lot of times doctors will dance around words. For example, the word cancer seems to be danced around a lot. Mass growth, lesion, nodule, and a slew of other terms, but we're not really dancing around it so much as when we haven't proven what it is. For example, if it's something on an X-ray that we're not entirely sure what it is, we'll often use the word lesion or mass or nodule, depending on how it looks. But nonetheless, we tend to use a lot of words that are somewhat synonymous, but not exactly. For example, the fact that cancer is always a tumor, but a tumor is not always cancer. Tumors can be benign, and technically, for example, a wart is a tumor. Next slide. Next slide, or, oh, I see. For this talk, what I'm going to be talking about are clinical trials. These are always investigational trials, meaning that we're requiring you to sign informed consent. In other words, we're going to actually inform you what we're going to do and making sure that you understand it, and then you sign something saying, I understand it. The informed consents tend to be a little bit long these days because, as with everything, there's federal government involvement. And once they get involved, you know things will get lengthy and complex. But we try to keep it as simple as possible. We also tend to use the word study for clinical trials, but a lot of things can be a study. For example, a CT scan can be a study. In order to conduct the clinical trial, we follow a protocol. And the protocol is actually written, usually about 70 to 80 pages, directions on how we behave, in addition to giving us, the people who are reading the protocol, some background as to why we're doing what we're doing in the course of the protocol. It's a written document, tells us what to do, tells us how often to treat, what to do if there's a side effect, who to call in case there's a side effect, who to let know if there's a side effect. The important thing to realize is that, of course, we have protocols that have nothing to do with clinical trials. We all have protocols we follow when we're treating people off of a clinical trial. If we're treating them in any way, we generally have protocols in our practices that the physicians follow to try and maintain consistency and the best possible care. Nonetheless, for the clinical trials, we do have a specific clinical trial-specific protocol. Next slide. So to get on with it, to know what we're going to be doing, first off, you have to understand what standard therapy is. And standard therapy can be a lot of things, but standards include a treatment standard, meaning what do we do in general to treat a person with stomach cancer? What's the standard chemotherapy regimen? And for example, for stomach cancer, there are actually several standard regimens that can be used, meaning they're all allowed, they're all proven to have effectiveness, they're all reasonable to use and safe to use with patients. For a clinical trial standard, that's what we call the standard arm. This could be any one of the many regimens that we use for stomach cancer, for example, but it's the arm that anything new must be compared to in order to get FDA approval. And I'll go through the steps in clinical trials, but that standard arm comes into play largest in the phase 3 trial. The two, treatment standards and clinical trial standards, are usually the same, but remember what I said. For example, stomach cancer has several treatment standards, and of course the clinical trial will probably only have one option of those many standards. Next slide. So the way a treatment becomes a standard is generally it has to have beaten something else. This can be a comparison trial against a placebo in many situations, but usually not in oncology. When we use placebos in oncology, it's usually in addition to standard treatment versus an experimental drug in addition to standard treatment, rather than using a placebo alone. There are some rare studies in oncology that use placebos, but they aren't very common because, of course, this is a deadly illness. It's not the same as using a placebo for a few weeks in a person who has high cholesterol. The other thing that a new treatment can be compared to get to become the new standard is to be just compared against the prior standard, which is a more common thing. So usually we compare something to what we generally do, and if the new thing is better, then it becomes the new standard. Once in a while, when we have something really spectacular, a single-arm trial is all we need. We don't need to compare it to a standard because it looks so good. And we did that with a tumor called GI stromal tumor, which does occur frequently in the stomach, and that's why I chose this one. It's a different type of cancer that can occur in the stomach, but we learned something about the way the tumor grows in the laboratory, and a new drug called Gleevec, or imatinib, was so good that it shrank the tumor in over 50% of the patients compared to our prior options, which we had none. So it got approved on one trial so fast that the company didn't even have time to come up with a name for the drug, and they had to borrow the name from another drug they were developing. Next slide. So this is the fun part. Again, doctors like to have a lot of terminologies, and chemotherapy is a term that's been around for a long time. And in fact, actually, it's used in a lot of different ways in a lot of different places. In fact, actually, the main journal on antibiotics is called the Chemotherapy Journal. But in reality, we use it fairly specifically to mean any chemical that we use to affect dividing cells, either DNA or the things associated with DNA. A lot of people use it to refer to any chemical used to treat anybody, but in cancer we really are specific that they're drugs that are geared to injure or kill dividing cells. We do have other drugs nowadays. For example, Debbie mentioned the drugs she's taking, which are considered biologics or targeted agents, because they actually target a protein and not DNA. These proteins are proteins that can stimulate cancers to grow, and therefore if you can block the proteins, you can stop the cancers from growing. Finally, and it's becoming more common, and in fact in stomach cancer a lot of us have trials open for this, there are immune therapies that are being developed that modify the immune system to make it so that it may be able to be used to attack the cancers and hopefully give patients a chance for longer term effectiveness. If immune therapy works and you can get the immune system to attack the drug in theory, the immune system to attack the cancer in theory, it will be a more effective way of doing things for a longer period of time. We haven't proven that yet, but this immune therapy is now much more under study than ever before. Next slide. So finally, some other terms. Stage. Classically, we stage diseases in 1 to 4. We have a few extra letters. The higher the number, the more advanced the disease is considered. Phase is a phase for the studies, and we're really going to talk about phase 1 to 3. There is a phase 4, which is just a post-marketing thing, and we're not going to talk about that. So that's referring to clinical trials phases. And then finally, adjuvant therapy. Just so you know the term, when all the disease is removed after surgery's been done and we're not sure if the cancer will come back, we're concerned about cells that are microscopic in size that we can't see, and therefore we can't cut them out because we don't know where to cut. And those are the things we worry about coming back later. Adjuvant therapy is given to try and kill those hidden cells. So that's a specific form. It can be chemotherapy, it can be biologic therapy, it can be immune therapy. Adjuvant just means some form of therapy given after the main treatment, which in this case would generally be surgery. Next slide. So what are the kinds of clinical trials? And actually this dog is giving me the same look right now. Next slide. Well, clinical trials, we need to know about a drug in order to use it. We need to know the right dose, the side effects, and most importantly, does it help and how does it help? We like to know everything we can about the drugs because if we know how it helps, we may know what might be added to it to make it work even better. So in the long run, our goal is not to make your scans prettier, it's to make people live longer. So shrinkage isn't always necessary if we can make the tumor stop growing, and that can produce just as good an effect. Next slide. Phase 1 trials is the earliest phase, and that takes what we know from the laboratories about a drug, chooses how to give it, and a presumed safe starting dose, and that's based on animal studies. I know there are many people, including me, who don't like the idea of animal studies, but some of those are absolutely necessary for us to know what's safe to give to a human and what surprising side effects we might have. Even with the studies we do, we sometimes have surprises. So slowly, but just a few patients at a time, we start with a low dose, and we raise the dose up with each new group of patients until we come up to a dose where we're starting to see too many side effects, we think, and then we stop and declare that the highest dose was the highest dose we can give. The highest dose, I mean, that we gave without significant side effects. We also, during that time, since we're treating a bunch of different patients, often with a lot of different cancers, it gives us hints of the effectiveness, and we might get some ideas. So, for example, if a trial has 4 patients with stomach cancer on it, and 3 of them have tumor shrinkage, we might move that trial. We most likely will move that drug into a trial in stomach cancer because we've already seen some hints of effectiveness. But remember, very few patients are treated at each dose, so it doesn't necessarily give us a full idea. And of course, what might be missed on these trials are the rare side effects. A side effect that happens in 1 in 100 times might not happen in a study where we only have 30 patients, which is commonly what is on a phase 1 trial. Next slide. Like you said, we get clues in phase 1, but we don't have that many patients treated each dose, so we move on to phase 2. Phase 2 is where we give 1 dose to 1 disease type, so no longer allowing people with stomach cancer, lung cancer, colon cancer, breast cancer, all in one trial. We have a trial specifically for example, stomach cancer. And it gives us a signal of how effective it is. We can look at it and compare it to a similar group of patients treated with other drugs in the past and say, does this look better or not? It also gives us even more of an important idea of side effects in a specific group of patients. So there are some groups of patients that don't tolerate some drugs as well as other groups of patients. And in fact, actually, there are some drugs like that seem to have a little bit more in the way of side effects in stomach cancer than they do, for example, in breast cancer patients. And we're not sure if that's related to prior surgeries and things like that, or what the actual cause is, and we can't even really prove how much of a difference there is, but there are some concerns. So it's always good to see what that side effect profile is in the group of patients you're treating. If we also learned that if the dose we found was actually correct. Once in a while we find out that the dose we found was a little bit too low, and once in an even rarer while we'll find out that we actually came up with too high a dose, and we have to start treating people at lower doses. And part of that is that in phase 1 there are a lot of patients who only receive a few cycles of therapy, whereas in phase 2 we'll have more patients who receive longer term, and sometimes the side effects build up and the drugs become more intolerable with time. Next slide. But phase 2 gives us enough idea of whether or not it may work to say, should we do a phase 3? Okay, not all phase 2 trials that look positive turn out to be positive phase 3s. So some of the promising drugs and some of the real exciting things that you see on the news that disappear, they had a good phase 2 trial, but in phase 3 they didn't necessarily work out. In phase 3 is where we compare this new treatment to the standard. This is where the standard comes into line. It proves if the new drug or drugs are better or not, and it is definitive, meaning that these are studies designed to prove something absolutely. It also gives us more information about side effects. Like I said, the more people you treat, well, I didn't actually say that before, but the more people you treat, the more information you have about side effects, especially the rare side effects might be missed. Sometimes the only place you catch it is in the randomized trial, where the side effect might seem like it's a symptom of the disease, but when it happens in more people on the experimental drug than on the standard, you suddenly realize that the experimental drug is adding to that symptom. Next slide. So what are the endpoints? And then by endpoints, while we're going to the next slide, these are the goals of the studies. And the main goal of all of our studies in the long run or short run is survival. Okay? Why will we choose a different endpoint? Sometimes the different endpoints, the other endpoints we choose other than survival, will help us find out enough to go forward into the final step of the phase 3 trial. But almost all phase 3 trials, the endpoint is overall survival. Do we make people live longer? Do we make more people survive for a longer period of time? That's our real question. But in the earlier phases, sometimes you can use these other endpoints to help give you an idea, are you on the right track? So in that adjuvant setting, or when we've cut out all the diseases, we'll use something either called disease-free survival or relapse-free survival. They are slightly different, but basically means the time, the average time for patients to not have had the cancer come back in a group of patients who are at risk for their cancer coming back. Now, not all patients will have their cancer come back, and of course our goal with the new treatment is to keep the cancer from coming back. But the disease-free survival can give us an earlier readout on whether or not the treatment's effective. Progression-free survival is slightly different in that that's patients who have visible cancer still left in, often metastatic or stage 4 cancer, where we can see the cancer on the CAT scan, and we see it at a certain size at the beginning of the study, and progression-free survival is from the start of the study until the disease starts growing, and what we mean by growing is there has to be a 20% increase in the size of the tumors that we're measuring. Finally, there's response rate. And response rate is the percentage of patients who have shrinkage of their disease, and by shrinkage of disease, we want to see at least a 30% decrease in the size of the tumors. So when I show my patients a CAT scan, if they have a 20% shrinkage, I point out that their tumor is responding off of a clinical trial. On a clinical trial, that wouldn't be counted as a response, but it's every bit as good in reality. We just have set off this criteria so that way we can have some standards while we're trying to compare one study to another. Next slide. And sorry if you can hear my dog snoring next to me, but he is. So again, we're torturing ourselves with all these terminologies. I'm giving you some idea of what these are. A lot of times when your doctor gives you information, and I don't do this, doctors will so-called give a person how much time they have or something like that, which I do not like to do, and I do not believe any doctor can do. They use something called the median, and that's what we measure a lot of times on our trials. The median is when half the patients have had the event. So if it's progression-free survival, that's when half the people have had their tumors grow, or how long has it taken from start of treatment until the tumor is grown in half the patients. But nowadays we're trying to get people, and even the physicians are having trouble switching this, to switch to something called the hazard ratio. The problem with a single time point like the median is that there can be some wiggle in the curves, that something can happen all of a sudden and there can be a change to make the curve look funny at the median. But if you actually take and compare an entire line to an entire line, it is more statistically pure. It requires a statistician, so it gives somebody a job, and that's always important. But it tells you the odds something's going to happen on the new treatment compared to the control or the standard arm, and the hazard ratio is more pure and more exact, and it's just a little bit more hard to put into numbers and think about, and that's been the difficulty in switching to hazard ratio. Next slide. I think I have some illustrations of this. So this is something called the MAGIC trial. This was for patients who were getting surgery, and the S in this thing is for getting surgery, and in this case the hazard ratio was 0.75, but if you look at the beginning of the curve, things are together because all the people, this is overall survival, all the people are doing well, but as people's cancers start coming back, that's unfortunately when patients start dying off at different rates, and the people who got the chemotherapy did better. But if you look at the 0.5 level, and you go across the bar, you see the curves are pretty close together. That would be the median. However, when you compare the line to the line, it looks much better because you can see that the curves keep separating over time. Next slide. Oops, there's my picture. So you can see that if you just use, for example, 12 months, or the people who were alive at 1 year, the two arms would look almost identical. Next. But if you cut across, and this is a different trial, if you cut across the median on some trials, like this one, while the hazard ratio came out different, favoring the experimental drug, you can see at the median, the yellow line used to be right at the 50. It kind of moved up. Sorry about that. But at the median, the two curves actually kiss. And so that's where the median becomes less accurate than comparing the curve to the curve. It's just that curves wobble back and forth a little bit. Next slide. This is a situation where you can't. I told you they might. Where you can see a separation on the overall survival. Both the hazard ratio can be separated and the median can be separated. Next slide. So that's enough about endpoints. The informed consent process, at the beginning I said we make sure you know what's going on. And this is important. I don't think, there are probably people on this who remember thalidomide and the problems with the thalidomide babies, that there were a bunch of babies that were born with abnormal arms and legs because of thalidomide years and years and years ago. That was an experimental drug, and it was given out without anybody getting consent. They didn't know what kind of risks they were getting, and we don't do that anymore. We let people know what we're doing, and we make sure they know what the risks are, what the benefits are, and this is the informed consent process. We tell people why we're doing the study, what's being done on the study, what are the risks and side effects, what might the alternatives be, and what might be the benefits to both you and to society. Because in reality, there are benefits to society on studies just as much as there could be benefits to the individual. And in all studies, we can't guarantee benefits to our patients. Next slide. So again, unfortunately, the informed consent has been tampered with by the U.S. government. And the U.S. government has always fulfilled the rule that all of us together are far dumber than each of us alone. And in an effort to make us informed patients of as much as possible, they've made us tell too much. My informed consents at Vanderbilt actually often tell people that it will hurt if we do a needle stick. I think we all know that if you get a needle stuck in your arm, it hurts. It might not hurt a lot, but it hurts. Nonetheless, we seem to have to tell people that. So informed consents have gotten very, very big, and the bottom line is a little bit harder to find. But the important thing is that the informed consent process involves staff, nurses, and doctors talking to the patients about these side effects, and that these people can help explain and help you get to the bottom line in understanding it. And that is their goal. Next slide. So I've just explained and I think shown that these are complex, but they're really not as complex as they seem. The bottom line is that we're trying to find better treatments for people. We do have a stepwise process. We unfortunately have used a lot of language that makes it seem very difficult. And while the regulatory societies have really been trying to make this so we've got oversight, and we do have oversight, and it's very important we have oversight. It also has created some paperwork and some confusing things. But your doctor and your doctor's team should be able to bring the trial down to the essentials. And of course, I think it's important to read the consent. There aren't any small print items, but it's important to read it to know what's going on. There's a lot of important stuff in it. And even if your question seems silly to you, it's important to ask it. Part of the informed consent process is that We document and we prove that we've given you time to ask your questions. Bottom line is the clinical trials are the future, and we don't make advances in treating cancer without performing the clinical trials. They will not, no new drug will get approved by the FDA without being studied first in a well-designed clinical trial. I think that was the last thing. Okay, there's a picture of Layla, but she deserves a picture because she's pretty.
Thank you, Jordan. What we'll do now is we'll turn to the questions that we received during the presentation. And the first question comes in, how does one keep abreast of different studies that are being conducted throughout the country?
That's a great question. There is a website, clinicaltrials.gov, and clinicaltrials.gov has some advantages that it has every trial being conducted in the country and actually multiple trials being conducted outside the country on it. And it is a searchable website, but we just actually had a discussion with the NCI that the searches often come up with too much. And it's often hard to narrow it down to what you get. And the NCI is actually, the National Cancer Institute, that is, it's actually working on making it better. They're working very hard to try and make it more searchable, more user-friendly. They are the ultimate database. I'm not sure if Debbie's Dream has any database at all, but the main is clinicaltrials.gov.
Yes, actually, the DDF website brings clinicaltrials.gov into our website to make it a little bit more manageable, and we also use Emerging Med to help patients navigate that.
That's great.
Okay. The next question that comes in is related. How do local oncologists find out about clinical trials?
They use the exact same method. The clinicaltrials.gov is a good method. Attending meetings is another great method. When we attend meetings or when we attend our own webinars, we learn about trials that are going on. I often learn about trials that way. When it comes to guys like me who specialize, I wouldn't know a thing about I actually barely know what breast cancer trials are being done at my own institution. I actually do know what most of them are. But I know a lot more about what's going on with stomach cancer trials because that's an area of strong interest for them. So some people can have it easier like me because I have fewer diseases. I actually have to think about what trials are going on. But even I don't know all the stomach cancer trials being conducted in this country.
Okay, thank you. The next question, does a clinical trial ever report as a negative study but actually help some of the patients?
Yes, actually that's a great question because the reality is that when we're talking about a clinical trial reporting positive, it needs to be enough positive to do better. So there are two types of situations. One where we can't figure out who those patients are who benefited. And in a lot of clinical trials where some people always seem to do better, but the drugs might come out as negative. There's a drug I worked with as a young fellow at University of Wisconsin named penclomidzine that won't ever come to the market. But in fact, there were a couple patients who were on the trial who really got a lot of benefit chance, and those patients definitely got benefit from the treatment we gave them. But we had so few patients overall that benefited, and we had a serious side effects. So that was read out as negative. There are other trials where we actually get a subset. For example, they may have a specific mutation in their cancer that gives us a clue as to a subset that may get benefit, and we may actually develop further trials looking at that one subset to see if that really was a group that gets more benefit, and therefore that drug is just for them and not for the big, broad group. So those are the two situations that we see. Great.
Thank you. The next question, if I have had chemo, do I still qualify for a clinical trial?
Yes. Different trials have different rules. So there are trials that are what we call first-line trials, meaning patients can't have been treated before to go on them. There are trials that are specifically designed for second line, and even some trials are specifically designed for third line. The phase 1 trials are often designed without a specific number of prior therapies. So people have been through 3 or 4 or 5 treatments may be able to go on a phase 1 trial. Actually, even more than 5 treatments have gone on phase 1 trials. I have patients with 7 or 8 different treatments who've gone on my phase 1 trials.
And would other clinical trials be part of that qualification?
Yes, so other patients who've been on one clinical trial can often go on a second, particularly phase 1 trials. Okay. And I will say that a lot of people think phase 1 is, and doctors included, think phase 1 is the last hope and last effect and things like that. But the fact is that phase 1 trials, when I started in 1992, it was very rare that we saw patients get benefit. But these days it's not uncommon. And so it's not as uncommon, and we get benefit for people. And I think it's a worthwhile thing to consider phase 1s. And oftentimes phase 1s are combining new drugs with drugs already known to have some effect. So it's important to know what the trial is. But yeah, phase 1 is often the place to go if you've had a lot of prior therapies.
Okay, thank you. And the last question we will take this evening, how can international patients who do not have insurance in the U.S. and maybe cannot afford to pay out of pocket participate in clinical trials?
Well, a lot of countries have clinical trials. I mean, I go to meetings in Europe and Asia, and of course there are studies presented in the United States, Europe, and Asia from all over the world, all the continents except Antarctica. And the reality is that you may be able to participate there. The Europeans have a very active clinical trial organization, as do the Asians. The Chinese have been moving forward clinical trials, as has India and Korea, Japan, and a lot of the other countries have long been involved. So there are certainly capabilities to get on these trials. Of note, the greatest supporter for the main European organization for clinical trials outside of the pharmaceutical industry is our own country.
And would the clinicaltrials.gov resource be searchable for international trials?
Yes, it may not be as thorough, but the reality is what happened was a lot of the medical journals now require that people register their clinical trials somewhere so that the data can be, so that people know that they're out there, and it kind of forces the data to be put out. And by doing that, most people have been registering their trials on clinicaltrials.gov because it is an easy place to register. So it won't catch all the international trials, but it will catch some major ones.
Okay, great.
But your doctors should know about the resources in their own country.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you to all of our listeners tonight. A special thank you to Debbie's Dream Foundation, Curing Stomach Cancer, Debbie Zellman, the president and founder, our speaker, Jordan Berlin from Vanderbilt University, and to Genentech for providing funding that helped make this webinar possible. As you see on the screen, we have upcoming events to get involved in and support. Details about these events are available on the Debbie's Dream website at www.debbiesdream.org. Our next clinical trial webinar will be held on January 7th at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time. We would love to hear your feedback, questions, and thoughts before then. Please send your comments to patient.resource@debbiesdream.org. For all who joined us this evening, thank you very much, and we look forward to hearing from you.